Hello and welcome to Night Historian. I'm grateful you have chosen to spend this hour with me. Before we begin, I ask a small favour. If this story resonates with you, subscribe. Share it with someone who might listen at night. In the comments below, tell me where you are in the world and what time you listen. I read every response. The story we explore tonight concerns itself with a question that shaped civilization itself. How does one move money safely across distance? This question seems simple until you consider its weight. A merchant in Florence needs to pay suppliers in Venice. He cannot carry gold through mountain passes and across sea routes without risking robbery, shipwreck, loss. Yet commerce demands payment. Trade requires trust. And from this tension between the practical need to move wealth and the danger of moving it, an entire system emerged. That system became more powerful than anyone anticipated. It moved beyond solving a merchant's problem. It became a tool of statecraft. It transformed how power itself flowed through the world. Tonight, we trace that transformation. We begin in the Mediterranean, in cities where merchants gathered before dawn, their vessels laden with goods and questions about how to proceed safely. Dim the lights, let us begin. The Mediterranean in the 14th century was a world of movement. Merchants from Florence, Venice, and Genoa sent their ships laden with cloth, spices, and metals across routes that connected Europe to the Islamic world and beyond. This commerce generated wealth on a scale that previous centuries had not witnessed. Yet beneath this prosperity lay a fundamental vulnerability that no amount of ambition could overcome. The problem was brutally simple. Moving money across distance was extraordinarily dangerous. A merchant in Florence who needed to pay a supplier in Venice faced a choice that offered no good options. He could carry coins himself, travelling by land and sea with a fortune that made him a target for bandits and pirates. The mountain passes between Italian city-states harboured thieves who understood that merchants carried value. The sea routes were no safer. Ships sank in storms. Crews sometimes murdered passengers for their cargo. Even if a merchant reached his destination alive, the coins might be counterfeit, clipped, or debased by previous handlers. Alternatively, he could entrust the money to a courier, but this merely transferred the risk rather than eliminating it. A courier could disappear with the funds. He could be robbed along the way. He could claim robbery when he simply pocketed the money himself. Trust in such arrangements rested on reputation alone, and reputation could be destroyed by a single betrayal. The Church complicated matters further through its doctrine against usury. Lending money at interest was considered sinful, a violation of Christian teaching. This prohibition meant that the financial mechanisms that might have emerged naturally from commerce were constrained by religious law. A merchant could not simply borrow money to finance his ventures. He could not pay interest for the use of capital. The entire structure of credit that modern economies take for granted did not exist in any systematic form. Yet commerce was growing. The Crusades had opened trade routes to the east. Italian merchants had established trading posts in Constantinople, Alexandria, and beyond. The spice trade alone generated enormous profits for those who could access it. Silk, pepper, and other luxury goods moved westward from Asia, creating demand that merchants rushed to satisfy. This expansion of trade meant that the problem of moving money became more acute, not less. More merchants needed to move larger sums across greater distances. Local economies remained fragmented. A florin minted in Florence held different value in Venice or Genoa. Currency exchange rates fluctuated based on supply, demand, and political circumstances. A merchant who converted his florins to ducats in one city might find those ducats worth less in another. This created both risk and opportunity, but primarily it created confusion. Without a unified currency system, every transaction across city boundaries involved calculation and negotiation about exchange rates. The physical reality of moving coins was not merely inconvenient. It was a constraint on commerce itself. A merchant could only move as much money as he could physically transport. This meant that large transactions required either multiple trips or partnerships with other merchants who could share the burden. It meant that opportunities were sometimes missed because the merchant lacked the capital to act quickly. It meant that the pace of commerce was limited by the pace at which physical money could move. Consider the practical situation of a Florentine cloth merchant in the year 1340. He has sold a large shipment of fine wool cloth to a buyer in Bruges, in what is now Belgium. The buyer owes him a substantial sum. The merchant needs that money to purchase more raw materials for his looms, to pay his workers, to maintain his business. Yet Bruges is months away by land and sea. To travel there himself to collect payment would consume weeks. To send a courier with instructions to collect payment creates the risk of theft or betrayal. To leave the money in Bruges and wait for it to be transported back to Florence exposes him to all the dangers of transport. This was not a problem unique to one merchant or one city. It was systemic. Every merchant engaged in long-distance trade faced variations of this same dilemma. Every growing commercial network encountered the same bottleneck. The problem was not that merchants lacked ambition or that opportunities did not exist. The problem was that the mechanisms to move value safely across distance did not exist. The Church's prohibition on usury meant that the obvious solution, borrowing money at interest to finance ventures, was not available. Merchants could not simply go to a lender and borrow capital. They could not pay interest for the use of that capital. This forced them to rely on their own resources or on informal partnerships with other merchants who shared the risk and reward of ventures. The fragmentation of political authority across Italy made matters worse. There was no central authority that could guarantee the safety of merchants or enforce contracts across city boundaries. A merchant who was robbed in Genoa could not appeal to Florentine authorities for justice. A contract signed in Venice might not be enforceable in Milan. This meant that commerce depended entirely on personal relationships and reputation. A merchant would trade with other merchants he knew or whose reputation he trusted. This limited the scale of commerce and made it difficult for new merchants to enter the market. Yet commerce continued to grow despite these obstacles. The profits from trade were too substantial to ignore. Merchants found ways to work around the constraints. They formed partnerships with other merchants. They relied on family networks that extended across multiple cities. They developed informal systems of credit and obligation. These systems worked, but they were inefficient. They limited the scale of commerce. They created opportunities for fraud and betrayal. They could not support the kind of systematic, large-scale financial activity that the growing European economy demanded. This was the world in which banking would emerge, not as an abstract concept or a theoretical innovation, but as a practical response to a concrete problem. Merchants needed to move money safely. The existing systems were inadequate. Someone would have to invent new mechanisms. Those mechanisms would transform not just commerce, but the entire structure of power in the medieval world. The first solution emerged not from theory, but from necessity. Merchants in the Mediterranean began to develop informal systems of credit that allowed them to move value without moving physical coins. These systems rested on a single foundation: the reputation of the merchant involved. If a merchant was known to be trustworthy, other merchants would accept his word as a substitute for physical payment. The earliest form of this solution was the letter of credit, known in Italian as a credenza. A merchant in Florence who needed to pay a supplier in Venice could deposit money with a trusted partner in Florence. That partner would write a letter authorizing the withdrawal of an equivalent sum in Venice from a corresponding merchant. The letter itself held no intrinsic value. It was merely a piece of parchment with writing on it. Yet if both merchants were known to be reliable, the letter could circulate as a form of payment. The supplier in Venice could present the letter to the corresponding merchant and receive coins in exchange. This system required absolute trust. The entire mechanism depended on the assumption that the merchant in Florence would actually honor the letter when presented. If he refused payment, the system collapsed. If he disappeared or went bankrupt, those holding his letters faced loss. For this reason, letters of credit were only accepted from merchants with established reputations. A new merchant, no matter how honest, could not issue letters of credit because no one would accept them. Trust had to be earned through years of reliable dealing. The Genoese and Venetian merchants pioneered these systems because their commercial networks extended across the Mediterranean. They had established relationships with merchants in multiple cities. They could rely on correspondence and reputation across distances. A Genoese merchant in Alexandria could write a letter to a Genoese merchant in Genoa, and that letter would be honoured because both men were part of the same commercial network. The network itself became a form of currency. These informal credit systems created the need for regular settlement points. Merchants could not simply accumulate letters of credit indefinitely. Eventually, accounts had to be settled in actual coins. This led to the development of great fairs where merchants from different regions gathered at scheduled times to conduct business and settle accounts. The Champagne fairs became famous for this purpose. Merchants from Italy, Flanders, and France would gather several times a year to trade goods and settle financial obligations. At these fairs, something remarkable occurred. Merchants would bring their account books and meet with counterparts from other cities. They would compare what they owed and what they were owed. Often the debts offset each other. A Florentine merchant might owe a Venetian merchant 50 florins, while the Venetian merchant owed the Florentine merchant 40 florins. Rather than moving 90 florins in coins, they could simply settle the difference of 10 florins. This process, called clearing, dramatically reduced the amount of physical money that needed to move. It also reduced the risk of robbery and loss. The fairs served another crucial function. They provided a venue where disputes could be resolved and contracts could be witnessed. If two merchants disagreed about the terms of a deal, they could appeal to other merchants at the fair who had witnessed the transaction. This created a form of commercial law that existed outside the formal legal systems of individual cities. Merchants developed their own rules and procedures for settling disputes. These rules became increasingly standardized as the same merchants attended the same fairs year after year. The concept of clearing extended beyond individual transactions. Merchants began to understand that they could offset obligations across multiple parties. If merchant A owed merchant B, and merchant B owed merchant C, and merchant C owed merchant A, the three could settle their accounts by having only one payment move. This required keeping careful track of who owed what to whom. It required trust that all parties would honour their obligations. But it dramatically reduced the amount of physical money in circulation. Historians still debate the extent to which these informal systems truly functioned as money. Certainly, letters of credit and promises to pay circulated among merchants. Certainly, these instruments reduced the need for physical coins. Yet the systems remained fragile. They depended entirely on reputation and personal relationships. A single major default could destroy the entire network. A merchant who disappeared or went bankrupt could cause cascading failures among all those who held his letters or owed him money. The systems also remained limited in scale. A merchant could only issue letters of credit up to the amount of money he actually held. He could not leverage his capital by issuing more letters than he could cover. This meant that the amount of credit available was constrained by the amount of physical money in circulation. The system could facilitate the movement of money that already existed, but it could not create new money or expand the money supply. Family networks played a crucial role in these early systems. Merchant families that had members in multiple cities could use their family connections to facilitate credit. A merchant in Florence could write to his brother in Venice, instructing him to pay money to a third party. The letter would be honoured because it came from a trusted family member. Over time, these family networks became more formalised. Families established branch offices in different cities. They developed standardised procedures for handling letters and settling accounts. They kept multiple copies of important documents to protect against loss or fraud. The Bardi family of Florence exemplified this approach. They established branches in multiple cities across Europe and the Mediterranean. They developed systems for tracking money movements across their network. They kept detailed records of transactions. They created procedures for verifying that letters of credit were authentic. Over generations, the Bardi built a network that could handle substantial volumes of commerce. Yet these early systems remained fundamentally limited. They could facilitate commerce among merchants who knew each other or belonged to the same family networks. They could not easily accommodate new merchants or transactions between merchants from different networks. They could not handle large-scale lending to rulers or governments. They could not create the kind of systematic, standardized financial infrastructure that the growing European economy would eventually demand. The problem was not that these early solutions were ineffective. They worked well enough for the merchants who used them. The problem was that they could not scale. They could not support the kind of financial activity that would emerge in the following centuries. A new system would be required. That system would emerge from the same practical problems that the early solutions addressed, but it would be far more ambitious in scope and far more powerful in its effects. The Medici family did not invent banking. They were not the first to issue letters of credit or to maintain branch offices across multiple cities. What they did was something more consequential. They systematized banking in a way that made it replicable, scalable, and profitable on an unprecedented scale. They transformed banking from an informal practice among merchant families into a formal business with standardized procedures and measurable returns. The Medici began as cloth merchants, not bankers. Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici, born in 1360, established the family's banking operations gradually. He recognized that the informal credit systems used by merchants could be formalized and expanded. More importantly, he understood that a bank could profit not merely from facilitating commerce, but from the difference between what it paid depositors and what it charged borrowers. This insight, simple as it seems, was revolutionary. Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1389, transformed the family enterprise into something far larger. Cosimo implemented double-entry bookkeeping across all Medici operations. This accounting method, which had been developed earlier by merchants in Venice and other cities, allowed precise tracking of assets, liabilities, income, and expenses. Every transaction was recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit. This dual recording created an internal check on accuracy. If the debits and credits did not balance, an error existed somewhere in the accounts. Double-entry bookkeeping might seem like a technical detail, but it represented a fundamental shift in how business could be conducted. Previous merchants kept records, but those records were often incomplete or inconsistent. A merchant might record that he received payment from a customer, but fail to record that he paid a supplier. The accounts could not be verified. Fraud was easy to conceal. Errors accumulated without anyone noticing. With double-entry bookkeeping, every transaction created a permanent record that could be verified. The accounts could be audited, discrepancies could be identified and investigated. This transparency allowed Cosimo to manage a far-flung network of branch offices with confidence. He could sit in Florence and know with reasonable certainty what was happening in Rome, Venice, Bruges, and London. He could identify which branches were profitable and which were losing money. He could hold branch managers accountable for their performance. The Medici established branches in the major commercial centres of Europe. Each branch operated semi-independently, with a local manager responsible for local operations. Yet each branch reported to Florence. The central office in Florence maintained master accounts that consolidated information from all branches. This created a unified financial entity that could move money between branches, pool capital, and distribute profits. It was the first truly multinational banking corporation. The Medici moved beyond facilitating commerce among merchants. They began to offer banking services to rulers and the church. They lent money to popes, kings, and princes. These loans were far larger than anything that informal merchant networks could handle. A pope might need to borrow 100,000 florins to finance a military campaign or construct a cathedral. No individual merchant could lend such a sum, but the Medici Bank, with its consolidated capital and its ability to pool resources from multiple branches, could. Lending to rulers was more profitable than lending to merchants, but it was also more risky. A merchant who could not repay a loan faced ruin and loss of reputation. A ruler who could not repay a loan could simply refuse to pay, and there was little the banker could do about it. The Medici managed this risk by demanding political concessions in exchange for loans. A ruler who borrowed from the Medici often found himself indebted not just financially, but politically. The banker became an advisor, a confidant, a power behind the throne. The Medici charged fees for their services rather than interest, at least officially. This was a way of navigating the church's prohibition on usury. A fee for services rendered was not the same as interest on a loan, or so the argument went. In practice, the distinction was often meaningless. The fees amounted to the same thing as interest. Yet the formal distinction allowed the Medici to operate within the framework of church law, while earning substantial profits. The Medici also profited from currency exchange. They maintained agents in major cities whose job was to track exchange rates between different currencies. A florin in Florence might be worth slightly more or less than a ducat in Venice, depending on supply and demand. The Medici could profit from these differences by buying currency where it was cheap and selling it where it was expensive. This required constant communication between branches and quick decision-making. The Medici developed a network of couriers who carried information about exchange rates between cities. This information network was itself valuable. The Medici could act on information about exchange rate movements before their competitors. The Medici Bank grew rapidly. By the 1450s, it was the largest financial institution in Europe. The family's wealth increased accordingly. This wealth translated into political power. The Medici used their financial resources to influence Florentine politics. They lent money to the city government. They financed public works. They supported artists and scholars. Gradually, they became the dominant force in Florence, though they maintained the fiction that Florence remained a republic governed by its citizens. Historians still debate the extent to which the Medici's banking success was due to superior business practices versus favourable political circumstances. Certainly, their systematic approach to accounting and management was superior to that of competitors. Certainly, their willingness to lend to rulers gave them access to profits that other bankers could not obtain. Yet they also benefited from the political stability of Florence and from their family's established reputation. A new banking family, no matter how well organised, could not have achieved what the Medici achieved without the foundation of trust that the family had built over generations. The Medici system was not perfect. It remained vulnerable to the same risks that had destroyed earlier banking families. A major default by a ruler could threaten the entire enterprise. A military defeat could make a ruler unable to repay loans. Political instability could disrupt the carefully balanced system of power and profit. Yet the Medici's systematic approach to banking allowed them to manage these risks better than their predecessors. They diversified their lending across multiple rulers and merchants. They maintained higher reserves. They monitored their branch managers carefully. They adapted their practices based on experience and changing circumstances. What the Medici created was not merely a successful business. They created a model that could be replicated. Other banking families studied the Medici system and attempted to copy it. The principles of double-entry bookkeeping, branch management, and systematic risk assessment became the foundation of banking across Europe. The Medici did not invent these principles, but they perfected them and demonstrated their profitability. In doing so, they transformed banking from an informal practice into a formal profession with standardized methods and measurable results. The transformation of banking into a systematic enterprise created something entirely new, a form of power that operated through financial networks, rather than through military force or hereditary authority. A ruler who controlled armies could conquer territory. A ruler who controlled banking networks could control the flow of capital itself. This shift in the nature of power was not obvious to those living through it, yet it fundamentally altered the political landscape of Europe. The Medici understood this transformation intuitively. They lent enormous sums to Pope Sixtus IV in the 1470s. The Pope needed money for military campaigns against rival powers in Italy and for the construction of grand buildings in Rome. The Medici provided the capital. In return, they gained influence over papal decisions. When the Pope needed advice on financial matters, he consulted the Medici. When the Pope needed to raise additional funds, he turned to the Medici. The banker became an intimate advisor to the most powerful religious figure in Christendom. This relationship was not unique to the Medici and the papacy. Banking families across Italy lent to rulers. The Bardi family lent to kings of Naples and Sicily. The Peruzzi family financed military campaigns in Tuscany. The Acciaiuoli family lent to various rulers in Greece and Italy. Each loan created a relationship of dependency. A ruler who borrowed from a banker became vulnerable to that banker's interests. If the banker withdrew credit, the ruler's military campaigns could not continue. If the banker demanded political concessions, the ruler often had little choice but to comply. The mechanism of this power was subtle but effective. A ruler did not need to be explicitly threatened. The banker did not need to demand specific political actions in exchange for loans. The dependency itself created alignment of interests. A ruler who knew that his military campaigns depended on the banker's willingness to lend would naturally consider the banker's preferences when making decisions. A ruler who owed substantial sums to a banker would be reluctant to take actions that might anger the banker or threaten the banker's wealth. This created a new form of political leverage. In the feudal system that had dominated medieval Europe, power flowed from military strength and hereditary authority. A lord with a large army could dominate his neighbours. A king with a strong claim to the throne could rule his kingdom. Banking introduced a different mechanism. A banker with control over capital could influence rulers without commanding armies. The banker's power was indirect but often more effective than direct military force. The Medici used their financial power to shape Florentine politics. They lent money to the city government. They financed public works that enhanced their reputation and popularity. They supported artists and scholars, creating a cultural prestige that translated into political influence. They arranged marriages between their family members and members of other prominent families, creating networks of obligation and alliance. Gradually, they became the dominant force in Florence, though they maintained the appearance of being merely wealthy citizens rather than rulers. Other banking families pursued similar strategies in other cities. In Venice, banking families influenced the government through their control of trade finance. In Genoa, bankers shaped policy through their role in financing colonial ventures. In Naples and Sicily, banking families became advisors to kings. The pattern was consistent. Control over capital translated into political influence. This transformation of power had profound implications. In the feudal system, a ruler's power was limited by the size of his army and the extent of his territory. A ruler could only control as much land as he could defend militarily. A ruler's wealth was limited by the taxes he could extract from his subjects. Banking introduced a different calculus. A ruler could borrow money to expand his army beyond what his current resources could support. A ruler could finance military campaigns that would conquer new territory and generate new wealth. A ruler could borrow against future revenues to finance present ambitions. Yet this new system of power created new vulnerabilities. A ruler who borrowed heavily became dependent on continued access to credit. If bankers lost confidence in a ruler's ability to repay, they could refuse to lend. A ruler who could not borrow could not finance military campaigns. A ruler who could not finance military campaigns could not conquer new territory or defend existing territory. The banker's withdrawal of credit could be as devastating as military defeat. The relationship between bankers and rulers was not always harmonious. Rulers sometimes defaulted on their loans, refusing to repay money they had borrowed. Bankers sometimes demanded repayment at inconvenient times, forcing rulers to raise taxes or sell assets. Yet despite these tensions, the system persisted. Rulers needed access to capital, and bankers needed access to rulers' revenues. This mutual dependency created a framework within which both parties operated. The Medici's relationship with the papacy exemplified this dynamic. The Medici lent money to popes for military campaigns and construction projects. In return, the popes granted the Medici lucrative contracts to collect church taxes in Florence and other regions. These contracts were enormously profitable. The Medici would collect taxes on behalf of the church and keep a percentage for themselves. They would also profit from the float, the money they held between collection and payment to Rome. The relationship was mutually beneficial, yet it also created dependency. The Pope depended on the Medici to collect his revenues. The Medici depended on the Pope's goodwill to maintain their profitable tax collection contracts. Historians still debate the extent to which the Medici controlled Florence, or Florence controlled the Medici. Certainly, the Medici's wealth gave them enormous influence. Certainly, they shaped Florentine policy to serve their interests. Yet Florence was not a simple autocracy ruled by the Medici. The city government maintained formal independence. Citizens participated in elections and debates. The Medici operated within these institutions rather than replacing them. Their power was real, but constrained by the need to maintain the appearance of republican governance. This tension between formal institutions and informal power became characteristic of Renaissance politics. Rulers maintained the structures of feudal or republican government while concentrating real power in their hands through financial networks. Bankers operated within legal frameworks while wielding influence that exceeded their formal authority. The visible structure of power and the actual exercise of power increasingly diverged. The implications extended beyond individual cities. Banking networks connected rulers across Europe. A pope in Rome, a king in France, a duke in Milan, and a merchant prince in Florence were all connected through networks of credit and obligation. These networks created a form of international politics that transcended traditional feudal relationships. A decision made in Florence could affect the finances of a ruler in Naples. A default by a ruler in England could threaten the solvency of bankers in Italy. The world was becoming financially integrated in ways that had not existed before. This integration created both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Opportunities existed for bankers who could navigate these complex networks and profit from the movement of capital. Vulnerabilities existed because the entire system depended on confidence. If confidence in a major banker collapsed, the effects could ripple across the entire network. A bankruptcy in one city could trigger bankruptcies in other cities as creditors rushed to recover their funds. The system was more powerful and more fragile than anything that had existed before. Behind the grand architecture of political power lay a more fundamental machinery, the mechanisms through which bankers actually generated profit. These mechanisms were not mysterious or complicated. They were based on simple principles of arithmetic and risk assessment. Yet the sophistication lay in how bankers combined these principles to create streams of income that could sustain large organizations and generate substantial wealth. The most straightforward source of profit came from lending money at interest. A banker would accept deposits from merchants and other wealthy individuals. These deposits would earn interest for the depositor, though the rates were modest. The banker would then lend this money to borrowers at higher rates. The difference between what the banker paid depositors and what borrowers paid the banker constituted the banker's profit. This spread between deposit rates and lending rates remains the fundamental business model of banking to this day. The rates themselves varied considerably, depending on the risk involved. A loan to a well-established merchant with a strong reputation might carry interest of 5 to 8%. A loan to finance a merchant venture to distant lands, where the risk of loss was substantial, might carry interest of 12 to 15%. A loan to a ruler was typically somewhere in between, perhaps 8 to 10%, though the actual rate depended on the ruler's creditworthiness and the political circumstances. Calculating the appropriate interest rate required judgment about risk. A banker needed to assess the likelihood that a borrower would repay. This assessment depended on the borrower's past behaviour, his current financial situation, the purpose of the loan, and the collateral he could offer. A merchant who had always repaid previous loans on time represented lower risk than a merchant with a history of defaults. A loan secured by specific assets represented lower risk than an unsecured loan. A loan for a venture that had proven profitable in the past represented lower risk than a loan for an untested venture. The Medici developed sophisticated methods for assessing creditworthiness. They maintained detailed records of borrowers' past behaviour. They investigated borrowers' current financial situations. They consulted with other bankers about their experiences with particular borrowers. They created categories of risk and assigned different interest rates accordingly. This systematic approach to risk assessment allowed them to lend more aggressively than competitors while maintaining acceptable default rates. Currency exchange represented another major source of profit. The Medici maintained agents in major cities whose primary responsibility was to track exchange rates between different currencies. A florin minted in Florence might be worth slightly more or less than a ducat in Venice, depending on the supply of each currency and the demand for it. Exchange rates fluctuated constantly based on commercial activity, political events, and changes in the money supply. The Medici profited from these fluctuations by buying currency where it was cheap and selling it where it was expensive. If the florin was trading at a discount in Venice, the Medici would buy florins there. If the florin was trading at a premium in Rome, the Medici would sell florins there. The difference between the purchase price and the sale price constituted profit. This required constant communication between branches and quick decision-making. The Medici's network of couriers carried information about exchange rates between cities. This information network was itself valuable because it allowed the Medici to act on exchange rate movements before competitors received the same information. The concept of agio, the premium charged for currency exchange, became standardized during this period. A merchant who needed to exchange florins for ducats would pay the banker a fee for the service. This fee was ostensibly compensation for the banker's work in arranging the exchange. In practice, the fee incorporated the banker's profit from the exchange. The fee varied depending on the currencies involved, the amount being exchanged, and market conditions. In times of currency instability, when exchange rates were volatile, the agio increased. In times of stability, the agio decreased. The Medici also profited from what modern bankers call the float. When a merchant deposited money with the bank held that money until the merchant withdrew it or instructed the bank to transfer it elsewhere. During the time the bank held the money, the bank could lend it to other borrowers and earn interest. The float represented the difference between when the bank received deposits and when it paid them out. In a growing economy with increasing commerce, the float could be substantial. The Medici could lend out money that technically belonged to depositors, earning interest on it, as long as they maintained enough reserves to meet withdrawal requests. Managing the float required careful calculation. A banker needed to maintain enough reserves to meet expected withdrawals. If a banker lent out too much of his deposits, he might find himself unable to meet a large withdrawal request. This could force him to borrow money at unfavourable rates or to sell assets at a loss. On the other hand, if a banker maintained too large a reserve, he was foregoing profitable lending opportunities. The optimal balance between safety and profitability was a constant concern for bankers. The Medici charged fees for various services beyond currency exchange. They charged fees for transferring money between branches. They charged fees for issuing letters of credit. They charged fees for managing accounts. These fees were typically modest individually, but they accumulated across thousands of transactions. A large banking operation could generate substantial income from fees alone. The Medici also profited from their role as tax collectors for the church. They would collect taxes on behalf of the papacy and keep a percentage for themselves. More importantly, they would hold the collected taxes for a period of time before remitting them to Rome. During this period, they could lend the money and earn interest. The float on church taxes could be enormous, particularly around times when large amounts were collected. Historians still debate the exact profitability of medieval banking operations. The surviving account books provide detailed information about transactions, but calculating overall profitability requires making assumptions about depreciation, overhead costs, and the value of the banker's own capital. What is clear is that successful banking operations were highly profitable. The Medici's wealth increased dramatically over generations. Other successful banking families also accumulated substantial fortunes. These fortunes were not generated through a single source of income, but through the combination of multiple revenue streams. The machinery of profit depended on several factors working together. First, the banker needed access to capital. This came from deposits, from the banker's own wealth, and from borrowing from other bankers. Second, the banker needed reliable information about exchange rates, creditworthiness, and market conditions. This information came from the banker's network of agents and correspondents. Third, the banker needed to manage risk carefully, maintaining enough reserves while lending aggressively enough to generate profits. Fourth, the banker needed to maintain reputation and trust. A banker whose borrowers defaulted at high rates would find it difficult to attract deposits or to borrow from other bankers. The system was not risk-free. A major default could threaten a bank's solvency. A sudden change in exchange rates could eliminate profits from currency trading. A loss of confidence could trigger a run on deposits, forcing a bank to liquidate assets at unfavorable prices. Yet for bankers who managed these risks successfully, the rewards were substantial. Banking offered a path to wealth and power that did not require military conquest or hereditary nobility. A talented banker with access to capital could build an empire of finance. Venice developed as a maritime power in ways fundamentally different from Florence. Where Florence rose through banking and finance, Venice rose through control of trade routes and naval dominance. This difference in origin shaped how Venetian banking evolved. Venice pursued a path that was more conservative, more state-controlled, and less focused on lending to rulers than the Florentine model. Understanding this alternative approach illuminates what was distinctive about the Medici system and what was universal to banking itself. Venice's wealth came from its monopoly on Mediterranean trade. Venetian merchants controlled the spice trade from the east. They maintained trading posts in Constantinople, Alexandria, and other key ports. They possessed the naval power to protect their trade routes from competitors. This maritime dominance generated enormous wealth, yet this wealth came from controlling the supply of goods, not from financial innovation. A Venetian merchant made money by buying spices cheaply in the east and selling them expensively in the west. The profit came from the difference between purchase price and sale price, not from lending money or managing currency exchange. Venetian banking emerged from this context of maritime commerce. Venetian bankers focused on financing trade voyages rather than on lending to rulers. A Venetian banker might lend money to a merchant to finance a voyage to Alexandria. The merchant would use the loan to purchase goods in Alexandria, transport them back to Venice, and sell them at a profit. The merchant would repay the loan plus interest from the profits of the voyage. This model of lending was fundamentally different from the Florentine model, which emphasized lending to rulers and managing international financial networks. The Venetian state itself played a more direct role in commerce than the Florentine state. Venice operated a state-owned merchant fleet. The government organized trading voyages and hired merchants to conduct them. The government regulated prices and controlled competition. This state involvement in commerce meant that Venetian banking developed within a framework of government regulation and control. A Venetian banker could not operate with the independence that a Florentine banker enjoyed. The Venetian government set rules about interest rates, about who could engage in banking, about how disputes would be resolved. This regulation created stability but limited innovation. Venetian bankers could not take the kinds of risks that Florentine bankers took. They could not lend aggressively to rulers. They could not engage in speculative currency trading. They could not expand their operations into new cities without government permission. The Venetian system was more conservative, but it was also more stable. Venice did not experience the banking crises that periodically struck other Italian cities. The Venetian approach to currency was more cautious than the Florentine approach. Venice maintained a stable currency, the ducat, which became one of the most trusted currencies in the Mediterranean. The Venetian government controlled the minting of the ducat carefully, maintaining its weight and purity. This stability made the ducat attractive to merchants and to foreign rulers. A merchant who accepted payment in ducats could be confident that the coins would retain their value. A ruler who borrowed money in ducats knew that he would be repaying in a stable currency. The stability of the ducat reflected the Venetian government's commitment to sound money. The government did not debase the currency to raise quick revenue, as some rulers did. The government did not allow excessive minting that would inflate the money supply. This commitment to monetary stability was partly ideological, reflecting a belief in honest dealing, but it was also practical. A currency that retained its value was more useful for commerce than a currency that was constantly losing value. Venetian bankers developed sophisticated systems for managing maritime risk. A merchant financing a voyage faced the risk that the ship might sink, that pirates might attack, that the cargo might be lost. To manage this risk, Venetian bankers developed contracts that distributed the risk among multiple parties. A merchant might borrow money from one banker, purchase insurance from another party, and enter into a partnership with other merchants to share the risk. These contracts became increasingly standardized and sophisticated. The development of maritime insurance represented a significant innovation. An insurer would agree to compensate a merchant if his ship was lost at sea. In exchange, the merchant would pay a premium. This premium was calculated based on the estimated risk of loss. A voyage to a nearby port with calm waters would carry a lower premium than a voyage to distant lands with dangerous waters. Over time, insurers accumulated enough data to calculate premiums with reasonable accuracy. They could pool the risks from multiple voyages, knowing that some would result in losses but most would not. Historians still debate whether Venetian conservatism represented wisdom or stagnation. Certainly, Venice avoided the banking crises that struck other cities. Certainly, the stability of the ducat was valuable. Yet Venice also missed opportunities for growth and innovation that more aggressive banking systems pursued. While the Medici were establishing branches across Europe and lending to rulers, Venetian bankers remained focused on trade finance. While Florentine bankers were developing new financial instruments, Venetian bankers were perfecting existing practices. By the 15th century, Venice was losing ground to Florence in banking. The Medici Bank was larger and more powerful than any Venetian banking operation. Florentine bankers had influence over popes and kings. Venetian bankers remained primarily merchants and traders. This shift in relative power reflected the different strategies the two cities pursued. Florence chose to pursue financial innovation and political influence through banking. Venice chose to maintain its dominance through maritime trade and naval power. Yet Venice remained enormously wealthy and powerful. The city's control of Mediterranean trade generated revenues that rivaled or exceeded those of Florentine banking. Venetian merchants lived in luxury. Venetian palaces rivaled those of Florence. The Venetian government commanded resources that allowed it to maintain a powerful navy and to influence Mediterranean politics. Venice did not need banking to achieve power and wealth. It achieved these through trade and naval dominance. The Venetian approach to governance also differed from the Florentine approach. Venice maintained a more Rigid oligarchic structure. A small number of merchant families controlled the government. These families maintained their power through formal institutions rather than through informal influence based on wealth. A Venetian merchant family could not achieve power through banking the way the Medici did in Florence. Power in Venice came from being part of the established oligarchy, not from accumulating wealth through financial innovation. This institutional difference shaped how banking developed in Venice. Banking remained a service industry rather than becoming a path to political power. A Venetian banker could become wealthy through banking, but he could not become politically powerful unless he was already part of the ruling oligarchy. This limited the incentive for Venetian bankers to pursue aggressive expansion and innovation. A Florentine banker like Cosimo de' Medici could use banking wealth to achieve political power. A Venetian banker could not. The contrast between Venice and Florence illustrates an important point about banking. Banking did not develop in a vacuum. It developed within specific political and social contexts. In Florence, where political power was fragmented and could be achieved through wealth, banking became a tool for accumulating power. In Venice, where political power was concentrated in an established oligarchy, banking remained primarily an economic activity. The same financial instruments and practices could lead to very different outcomes depending on the political context in which they operated. By the end of the 15th century, the two cities represented different models of how a commercial republic could organize itself. Florence had become a banking republic, where financial power translated into political power. Venice remained a merchant republic, where maritime trade and naval power were the foundations of wealth and influence. Both models were successful, yet they led to very different outcomes in subsequent centuries. Understanding both models is essential to understanding how banking became intertwined with power in the medieval world. Genoa presented a third model of how a Mediterranean maritime power could organize itself financially. Like Venice, Genoa was a naval power that controlled important trade routes. Yet Genoese banking developed differently from Venetian banking. Where Venice pursued conservative, state-controlled commerce, Genoa pursued aggressive private ventures. Where Venice maintained a unified oligarchy, Genoa fragmented into competing merchant families. This fragmentation and competition drove Genoese bankers to innovate in ways that neither Venetian nor Florentine bankers did. Genoa's geography made it a natural rival to Venice. Both cities sat on the Adriatic coast and competed for control of Mediterranean trade. Yet Genoa looked westward toward the Atlantic and Africa, while Venice looked eastward toward Constantinople and the Levant. This difference in orientation shaped their commercial strategies. Venetian merchants focused on the established spice trade from the east. Genoese merchants were willing to invest in riskier ventures to distant and less-known lands. This willingness to take risks became characteristic of Genoese banking. Genoese bankers financed expeditions to the Black Sea, to North Africa, and eventually to the Atlantic. These ventures were far riskier than the established trade routes that Venetian merchants controlled. A ship sailing to the Black Sea faced the risk of piracy, shipwreck, and loss of cargo. A merchant investing in such a venture could lose his entire investment. Yet if the venture succeeded, the profits could be enormous. Spices and other goods from the Black Sea could be sold in Western Europe at substantial markups. The high risk was offset by the possibility of high returns. This willingness to take risks extended to how Genoese bankers structured their investments. Rather than a single merchant financing a venture with his own capital, Genoese bankers developed systems where multiple investors could pool their capital and share the risk. A merchant might organize a venture to the Black Sea and invite other merchants to invest in it. The profits would be divided among the investors in proportion to their investments. If the venture failed, each investor would lose only his share of the investment, not his entire fortune. This system of shared investment represented an important innovation. It allowed merchants to undertake ventures that were too risky or too expensive for any single merchant to finance alone. It distributed risk among multiple parties, making it possible to pursue ventures that would otherwise be impossible. Over time, these shared investment arrangements became more formalized. Standard contracts emerged that specified how profits would be divided, how disputes would be resolved, and what obligations each investor had. The Genoese system of shared investment was a precursor to the modern joint stock company. Investors would contribute capital to a venture. They would receive a share of the profits proportional to their investment. They could sell their share to another investor if they wished to exit the venture. The venture itself became a separate entity with its own legal status, distinct from the investors who funded it. This separation of the venture from the individual investors allowed for more sophisticated financial arrangements. Genoese bankers also developed sophisticated systems for managing maritime insurance. An insurer would agree to compensate an investor if a venture failed due to shipwreck, piracy, or other maritime disasters. The insurer would charge a premium calculated based on the estimated risk. Over time, insurers accumulated data about the frequency of losses on different routes and in different seasons. They could use this data to calculate premiums with reasonable accuracy. They could pool the risks from multiple voyages, knowing that most would succeed even if some failed. The development of maritime insurance allowed merchants to pursue risky ventures with greater confidence. A merchant who had purchased insurance knew that if his ship sank, he would be compensated. This reduced the catastrophic risk of losing his entire investment. It made it possible to pursue ventures that would otherwise be too risky. Insurance also allowed insurers to profit from their expertise in assessing and managing risk. An insurer who could accurately calculate premiums could accumulate substantial profits over time. Competition among Genoese merchant families drove continuous innovation in financial arrangements. Unlike Venice, where a small oligarchy controlled commerce, Genoa had many competing merchant families. Each family sought to outdo the others in finding new trading opportunities and developing new financial instruments. This competition created pressure to innovate. A family that used the same methods as its competitors would not gain advantage. A family that developed new methods could gain market share and increase its profits. This competitive environment sometimes turned violent. Genoese merchant families fought naval battles against each other and against Venetian competitors. These battles were fought partly over control of trade routes and partly over control of banking networks. A family that controlled a profitable trade route could monopolize the profits from that route. A family that controlled a banking network could profit from financing other merchants' ventures. Control of these networks was worth fighting for. The competition between Genoa and Venice for Mediterranean dominance shaped the development of banking in both cities. Venice sought to maintain its dominance through superior naval power and state control of commerce. Genoa sought to challenge Venetian dominance through aggressive private ventures and financial innovation. Neither city could afford to ignore what the other was doing. Venetian bankers had to respond to Genoese innovations. Genoese bankers had to match Venetian naval power with financial sophistication. Historians still debate the extent to which Genoese banking innovations influenced the development of banking elsewhere in Europe. Certainly, the systems of shared investment and maritime insurance that Genoese bankers developed became more widespread over time. Certainly, other banking centres learned from Genoese practices. Yet Genoa itself never developed a banking system as centralised or as powerful as the Medici system in Florence. Genoese banking remained fragmented among competing families. No single Genoese banking family achieved the dominance that the Medici achieved in Florence. This fragmentation reflected Genoa's political structure. Genoa was governed by competing merchant families, each seeking to increase its own power and wealth. The city government was weak and frequently contested. Different families controlled the government at different times. This political instability made it difficult for any single banking family to establish long-term dominance. A family that became too powerful might face opposition from other families. A family that lost political support might find its banking operations threatened. Yet Genoese bankers developed financial instruments and practices that proved influential. The systems of shared investment that Genoese bankers pioneered eventually became the basis for joint stock companies. The maritime insurance contracts that Genoese bankers developed became models for insurance arrangements elsewhere. The willingness to take risks on new ventures that characterized Genoese banking influenced how bankers in other cities approached new opportunities. The Genoese approach to banking represented a different strategy than either the Florentine or Venetian approaches. Florence pursued centralized banking under family control, using banking wealth to achieve political power. Venice pursued state-controlled banking focused on trade finance, maintaining stability through regulation. Genoa pursued decentralized banking among competing families, driving innovation through competition. Each approach had strengths and weaknesses. Each contributed something different to the development of banking in Europe. By the 16th century, Genoa's role in Mediterranean commerce was declining. The discovery of sea routes to the Indian Ocean and the Americas shifted the focus of European commerce away from the Mediterranean. Venetian and Genoese merchants, who had dominated Mediterranean trade, found their markets shrinking. Florentine bankers, who had developed the most sophisticated financial systems, found themselves increasingly focused on European banking rather than Mediterranean trade. The center of gravity in European commerce was shifting northward toward the Atlantic and toward the emerging nation-states of Western Europe. The banking systems that emerged in medieval Italy appeared stable and powerful. The Medici bank seemed invulnerable, yet history demonstrates repeatedly that systems built on confidence are fragile. A single major default can trigger cascading failures. A loss of confidence can transform a thriving financial network into a collapsing ruin. The 14th century provided a stark demonstration of this vulnerability when the banking system experienced a crisis that destroyed some of its largest institutions. The Bardi and Peruzzi families were among the most prominent banking families in Florence during the early 14th century. The Bardi Bank was one of the largest financial institutions in Europe. The Peruzzi Bank was nearly as large. Both families had established branch networks across Europe. Both families lent to rulers, financed trade, and managed deposits. Both families accumulated substantial wealth. Yet both families faced a catastrophe that destroyed their enterprises and triggered a broader financial crisis. The crisis centered on lending to King Edward III of England. Edward III pursued ambitious military campaigns in France, seeking to enforce his claim to the French throne. These campaigns required enormous sums of money. Edward III borrowed heavily from Italian bankers, including the Bardi and Peruzzi. The loans were substantial, amounting to hundreds of thousands of florins. The bankers believed that Edward III would repay the loans from the revenues of his kingdom. This belief proved catastrophically wrong. Edward III's military campaigns in France were expensive, but ultimately unsuccessful. The king could not conquer France. His revenues were insufficient to repay the enormous loans he had taken. In 1339 and 1340, Edward III defaulted on his loans. He simply refused to repay the money he had borrowed. The Bardi and Peruzzi faced a crisis. They had lent out capital that they did not possess. They had accepted deposits from merchants and other wealthy individuals, promising to repay those deposits on demand. They could not repay those deposits because the money was tied up in loans to Edward III that would not be repaid. The default triggered a cascade of failures. Other bankers who had lent to the Bardi and Peruzzi sought to recover their funds. Depositors who had entrusted money to the Bardi and Peruzzi demanded withdrawal. The banks could not meet these demands. They lacked sufficient liquid capital. They were forced to sell assets at whatever price they could obtain. As assets flooded the market, prices collapsed. The banks' losses accelerated. Within months, both the Bardi and Peruzzi were insolvent. The failure of these two major banks sent shockwaves through the banking system. Other banks that had lent to the Bardi and Peruzzi faced losses. Merchants who had deposited money with the Bardi and Peruzzi lost their savings. The crisis spread beyond Florence. Banking families in other Italian cities that had connections to the Bardi and Peruzzi faced difficulties. The failure of one major bank threatened to trigger failures in other banks. Confidence in the banking system evaporated. The economic consequences were severe. Merchants who had lost deposits faced ruin. They could not finance new ventures. They could not pay their workers. Some merchants went bankrupt. Others were forced to liquidate their businesses. The disruption to commerce was substantial. Trade declined. Economic activity contracted. The crisis contributed to a broader economic downturn that affected much of Europe. The political consequences were equally significant. Rulers who had borrowed from the Bardi and Peruzzi faced pressure to repay their loans or faced the anger of the bankers' creditors. Yet many rulers, like Edward III, had no intention of repaying their loans. The default by Edward III demonstrated that a ruler could refuse to repay a banker with impunity. This realization undermined confidence in lending to rulers. Bankers became more cautious about lending to rulers in subsequent years. The Bardi and Peruzzi families never fully recovered from this crisis. The Bardi Bank continued to operate, but it was a shadow of its former self. The Peruzzi Bank eventually ceased operations. The family's wealth was severely diminished. Their political influence declined. Other banking families that had survived the crisis intact gained relative advantage. The Medici, who had been more cautious about lending to rulers and had maintained higher reserves, emerged from the crisis in a stronger position than before. The crisis of the Bardi and Peruzzi revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in the banking system. The system depended on the assumption that borrowers would repay their loans. When a major borrower defaulted, the entire system was threatened. The system also depended on confidence. When confidence evaporated, depositors rushed to withdraw their funds, forcing banks to liquidate assets at unfavorable prices. The system was more fragile than it appeared. The crisis also revealed the dangers of over-leveraging. The Bardi and Peruzzi had lent out far more money than they actually possessed. They had relied on the assumption that deposits would remain stable and that borrowers would repay on schedule. When both assumptions proved false, the banks collapsed. This lesson would shape banking practices for centuries to come. Prudent bankers would maintain higher reserves and would be more cautious about lending to rulers. The specific amounts involved in the Bardi and Peruzzi crisis were staggering for the time. The Bardi Bank lent approximately 900,000 florins to Edward III. The Peruzzi Bank lent approximately 600,000 florins. These sums represented an enormous portion of the capital available in the medieval banking system. The loss of this capital disrupted commerce across Europe. The crisis demonstrated that the banking system, despite its sophistication, could not absorb losses of this magnitude without severe disruption. The crisis also demonstrated the interconnectedness of the banking system. The Bardi and Peruzzi were not isolated institutions. They were connected to other banks through networks of lending and borrowing. When they failed, the effects rippled through these networks. Banks that had lent to the Bardi and Peruzzi faced losses. Banks that had borrowed from the Bardi and Peruzzi faced difficulties repaying. The failure of one institution threatened to trigger failures in other institutions. Historians still debate the extent to which the Bardi and Peruzzi crisis contributed to the broader economic downturn of the 14th century. Certainly, the banking crisis disrupted commerce. Certainly, the loss of capital available for lending constrained economic activity. Yet other factors also contributed to the downturn, including plague, warfare, and harvest failures. The banking crisis was one factor among many that contributed to economic contraction. The crisis also raised questions about the role of government in banking. Should rulers regulate banking to prevent excessive lending? Should rulers guarantee deposits to prevent bank runs? Should rulers punish rulers who defaulted on their loans? These questions were debated by contemporaries and remain relevant today. The medieval world had no clear answers. Different cities adopted different approaches. Venice maintained strict regulation of banking. Florence allowed more freedom, but expected bankers to manage their own risks. Genoa remained decentralized with limited regulation. The Bardi and Peruzzi crisis demonstrated that banking, despite its sophistication and apparent stability, remained fundamentally risky. A system built on confidence could collapse when confidence evaporated. A system that depended on borrowers repaying their loans could fail when borrowers defaulted. A system that relied on deposits remaining stable could be destroyed by a bank run. These vulnerabilities would persist as banking evolved. The challenge for bankers would be to manage these risks while still pursuing profitable opportunities. The collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks was not merely a catastrophe to be mourned, it was a teacher. The bankers who survived the crisis learned lessons that shaped how banking would develop in subsequent centuries. These lessons were not written in formal treatises or proclaimed in official decrees. They were embedded in the practices that successful bankers adopted in response to the crisis. They were learned through bitter experience and transmitted through the networks of merchant families and banking houses. The most fundamental lesson concerned the dangers of over-leveraging. The Bardi and Peruzzi had lent out far more money than they possessed. They had assumed that deposits would remain stable and that borrowers would repay on schedule. When both assumptions proved false, the banks collapsed. Bankers who survived the crisis understood that they could not lend out all their capital. They needed to maintain reserves that could meet unexpected withdrawals or cover unexpected defaults. The question became, how much reserve was enough? Different bankers reached different conclusions. Some maintained very high reserves, perhaps 30 or 40% of their capital. This conservative approach reduced the risk of failure, but also reduced profitability. A banker who maintained high reserves could not lend as aggressively and therefore could not earn as much interest. Other bankers maintained lower reserves, perhaps 10 or 15%. This more aggressive approach allowed higher profitability but carried greater risk. The optimal balance between safety and profitability remained a matter of judgment and experience. The Medici adopted a middle position. They maintained reserves that were higher than some competitors, but lower than the most conservative bankers. More importantly, they developed systems to monitor their reserves continuously. They required branch managers to report regularly on their cash positions. They adjusted lending policies based on reserve levels. If reserves fell below a certain threshold, they would reduce new lending until reserves recovered. This active management of reserves allowed the Medici to pursue profitable lending while maintaining reasonable safety. The crisis also taught bankers about the importance of the diversification. The Bardi and Peruzzi had concentrated too much of their lending in a single borrower, King Edward III. When Edward III defaulted, the banks faced catastrophic losses. Bankers who survived the crisis understood that they could not depend on a single borrower or a single source of income. They needed to diversify their lending across multiple borrowers. They needed to diversify their income sources across interest, fees, and currency exchange. They needed to diversify geographically, operating in multiple cities so that a crisis in one location would not destroy the entire enterprise. The Medici implemented strict rules about the maximum amount that could be lent to any single borrower. A rule might specify that no more than 10% of the bank's capital could be lent to any single borrower. This rule ensured that even if a major borrower defaulted, the bank would not face catastrophic losses. The rule also encouraged the bank to develop relationships with many borrowers rather than depending on a few large loans. This diversification reduced risk and created more stable income streams. Bankers also learned about the importance of creditworthiness assessment. The Bardi and Peruzzi had lent to Edward III based on the assumption that a king would repay his debts. This assumption proved false. Bankers who survived the crisis understood that they needed to assess the actual ability and willingness of borrowers to repay, regardless of the borrower's status or reputation. A king might refuse to repay a loan. A wealthy merchant might go bankrupt. A ruler might be overthrown. None of these events could be ruled out simply because the borrower seemed powerful or well established. The Medici developed sophisticated methods for assessing creditworthiness. They investigated borrowers' past behavior. They examined their current financial situations. They consulted with other bankers about their experiences with particular borrowers. They created categories of risk and assigned different interest rates accordingly. They required collateral for risky loans. They demanded political concessions from rulers in exchange for loans, creating leverage that could be used to enforce repayment. These practices represented an evolution in how bankers thought about risk. The crisis also prompted reforms in accounting practices. The Medici implemented even more rigorous double-entry bookkeeping than had been used before. They required multiple people to verify important transactions. They created systems to prevent fraud and embezzlement. They maintained detailed records that could be audited. These reforms made it possible to detect problems before they became catastrophic. A branch manager who was embezzling funds could be caught before the embezzlement destroyed the branch. A loan that was going bad could be identified and addressed before it resulted in a complete loss. Bankers also learned about the importance of maintaining confidence. The Bardi and Peruzzi crisis had demonstrated that confidence was fragile. A rumor that a bank was in trouble could trigger a run on deposits. Depositors would rush to withdraw their funds before the bank collapsed. The bank would be forced to liquidate assets at unfavorable prices, accelerating the collapse. Bankers who survived the crisis understood that they needed to maintain confidence at all costs. They needed to appear stable and solvent, even during difficult times. They needed to communicate regularly with depositors and creditors, assuring them that the bank was sound. The Medici were masters of maintaining confidence. They lived in grand style, displaying their wealth through magnificent palaces and patronage of the arts. They made strategic, charitable donations that enhanced their reputation. They maintained close relationships with the church and with rulers, creating the impression that they were indispensable to the functioning of society. They were careful about what information they disclosed about their operations, revealing enough to demonstrate soundness, but not so much as to invite scrutiny. These practices maintained confidence in the Medici Bank even during difficult periods. Historians still debate the extent to which the reforms implemented after the Bardi and Peruzzi crisis were sufficient to prevent future crises. Certainly, the reforms reduced the likelihood of catastrophic failures caused by over-leveraging or fraud. Certainly, the reforms made the banking system more resilient, yet the reforms could not eliminate risk entirely. Bankers still faced the fundamental challenge of assessing creditworthiness and managing uncertainty. Borrowers still sometimes defaulted unexpectedly. Rulers still sometimes refused to repay their loans. Markets still sometimes moved in unexpected directions. The reforms also created new challenges. More conservative lending practices meant that less capital was available for commerce. Merchants who wanted to borrow money faced higher interest rates and stricter requirements for collateral. This made it more difficult for new merchants to enter the market and for existing merchants to expand their operations. The reforms that made banking safer also made it less dynamic. The balance between safety and dynamism remained a tension that bankers had to navigate. The crisis of the Bardi and Peruzzi also prompted political reforms. Rulers became more cautious about borrowing from bankers. They understood that bankers could refuse to lend if they lost confidence in the ruler's ability to repay. Rulers also understood that bankers could use their financial power to influence political decisions. Some rulers attempted to regulate banking more strictly. Some rulers attempted to establish state-controlled banking systems that would be more responsive to political needs. These political responses to banking crises would shape the development of banking and government relationships for centuries to come. The lessons embedded in the Bardi and Peruzzi crisis were not forgotten. They were transmitted through the networks of merchant families and banking houses. Young bankers learned from their elders about the dangers of over-leveraging and the importance of diversification. These lessons became part of the culture of banking. They influenced how bankers thought about risk and how they structured their operations. The crisis, though devastating at the time, contributed to the development of more sophisticated and resilient banking practices. The systems that medieval Italian bankers created did not disappear when the Renaissance ended or when the centre of European commerce shifted northward. The principles they developed, the instruments they invented, and the practices they refined persisted and evolved. They became the foundation upon which modern banking would be constructed. To understand contemporary finance, one must trace its lineage back to the merchants and bankers of medieval Italy. Double-entry bookkeeping remains the standard accounting method used worldwide. Every business that maintains financial records uses the fundamental principle that the Medici and other medieval bankers perfected. Every transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit. This dual recording creates an internal check on accuracy. Modern accountants use computerized systems, but the underlying logic remains unchanged from what medieval bankers developed. The principle is so fundamental that it is difficult to imagine how accounting could function without it. The concept of interest rates originated in medieval banking. Medieval bankers charged different rates depending on the risk of the loan and the duration of the loan. They understood that a borrower should pay more for a riskier loan and more for a longer-term loan. This principle remains central to modern finance. Contemporary banks charge different interest rates for mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards based on risk and duration. The Federal Reserve sets benchmark interest rates that influence all other interest rates in the economy. The entire structure of modern finance rests on the principle that the cost of borrowing should reflect the risk and duration of the loan. Currency exchange markets trace their origins directly to medieval banking. Medieval bankers profited from buying currency where it was cheap and selling it where it was expensive. They maintained networks of agents who tracked exchange rates across cities. They communicated regularly to identify profitable opportunities. Modern currency exchange markets operate on the same principle, though at vastly greater scale and speed. Trillions of dollars exchange hands daily in currency markets. The exchanges occur electronically rather than through physical transport of coins, yet the fundamental logic remains: profit from differences in exchange rates across locations. The concept of a bank as an intermediary between depositors and borrowers emerged in medieval banking. Medieval bankers accepted deposits from merchants and other wealthy individuals. They lent this money to borrowers at higher rates than they paid depositors. The difference between deposit rates and lending rates constituted the banker's profit. This model remains the foundation of banking today. A modern bank accepts deposits from customers. The bank pays interest on the deposits. The bank lends the money to borrowers at higher rates. The difference between deposit rates and lending rates is the bank's primary source of profit. Risk management and diversification are medieval banking principles. Medieval bankers understood that they could not lend all their capital to a single borrower. They understood that they needed to maintain reserves for unexpected withdrawals or defaults. They understood that they should diversify their lending across multiple borrowers and multiple sources of income. These principles remain central to modern banking regulation. Banks are required to maintain minimum reserve ratios. Banks are required to diversify their lending portfolios. Regulators monitor banks to ensure that they are not taking excessive risks. The separation of banking from government, at least in theory, has roots in medieval banking. Medieval bankers operated as private enterprises, not as government agencies. They maintained independence from rulers, though they were often influenced by political considerations. This separation allowed bankers to develop sophisticated financial systems that served commerce rather than merely serving political needs. Modern banking systems maintain this separation, though the relationship between banks and government remains complex. Central banks are government agencies, but Commercial banks are typically private enterprises. This separation allows for more sophisticated financial systems than would be possible if banking were entirely controlled by government. The stock market traces its origins to medieval investment partnerships. Medieval bankers developed contracts that allowed multiple investors to pool capital and share profits from ventures. These contracts specified how profits would be divided and how disputes would be resolved. Over time, these contracts became more standardized and more sophisticated. They eventually evolved into the shares and stocks that are traded on modern stock exchanges. A modern stock represents a share of ownership in a company. An investor who purchases stock receives a proportional share of the company's profits. The principle is directly descended from medieval banking practices. Credit ratings and creditworthiness assessments began with medieval bankers. Medieval bankers investigated borrowers' past behavior and current financial situations. They created categories of risk and assigned different interest rates accordingly. They consulted with other bankers about their experiences with particular borrowers. Modern credit rating agencies perform similar functions. They investigate borrowers' creditworthiness. They assign credit ratings based on their assessment of default risk. They provide information to lenders about the creditworthiness of potential borrowers. The principle is the same. Assess the likelihood that a borrower will repay and price the loan accordingly. The concept of leverage, borrowing to invest, is medieval in origin. Medieval bankers understood that they could lend out more money than they possessed by accepting deposits and using those deposits to make loans. This leverage allowed them to expand their operations beyond what their own capital would permit. Modern financial institutions use leverage extensively. A bank might have capital of $1 billion, but lend out $10 billion by accepting deposits and borrowing from other banks. This leverage amplifies both profits and losses. When investments succeed, leverage amplifies profits. When investments fail, leverage amplifies losses. The principle remains the same as in medieval banking. Modern banking crises echo the patterns of medieval banking failures. When confidence in a bank collapses, depositors rush to withdraw their funds. The bank is forced to liquidate assets at unfavorable prices. This accelerates the collapse. Other banks that have lent to the failing bank face losses. These losses can trigger failures in other banks. The crisis spreads through the financial system. This pattern repeated itself in the Great Depression of the 1930s. It repeated itself in the financial crisis of 2008. The fundamental dynamics remain unchanged from the medieval period. Historians still debate how much of modern finance is truly new versus how much is medieval innovation adapted to new circumstances. Certainly, modern technology has transformed how financial transactions occur. Electronic systems have replaced physical transport of coins and parchment documents. Computers have replaced handwritten ledgers. The scale of modern finance is vastly larger than medieval finance, yet the fundamental principles remain recognizable. The mechanisms through which profit is generated remain similar. The risks that financial systems face remain similar. The vulnerabilities that can trigger crises remain similar. The transition from medieval banking to modern banking was gradual. The principles developed by medieval bankers were transmitted to bankers in subsequent centuries. These bankers adapted the principles to new circumstances. They developed new instruments and new practices, but they built on the foundation that medieval bankers had created. The banking systems of the 17th and 18th centuries were more sophisticated than medieval systems, but they remained recognizable descendants of medieval banking. The banking systems of the 19th and 20th centuries continued this evolution. The geographical center of banking shifted over time. The Italian city-states declined in importance as the center of European commerce moved northward. Antwerp became a major banking center in the 16th century. Amsterdam became dominant in the 17th century. London became the financial capital of the world in the 19th century. New York assumed that role in the 20th century. Yet regardless of where banking was centered, the fundamental principles remained those developed in medieval Italy. Bankers everywhere used double-entry bookkeeping. Bankers everywhere charged interest rates that reflected risk. Bankers everywhere maintained networks of correspondence to facilitate transactions across distances. The principles that medieval bankers developed proved so effective that they became universal. They were not unique to Italian banking or to medieval banking. They represented solutions to fundamental problems that any banking system must solve. How should a bank track its transactions? How should a bank assess creditworthiness? How should a bank manage risk? How should a bank maintain confidence? These questions are as relevant today as they were in medieval times. The answers that medieval bankers developed remain relevant because they address fundamental challenges. The legacy of medieval Italian banking extends beyond the technical aspects of banking. The medieval bankers demonstrated that financial systems could be powerful tools for organizing society. They showed that capital could be accumulated and deployed to achieve ambitious goals. They showed that financial networks could be as important as military networks in determining political power. They showed that sophisticated financial systems could support large-scale commerce and complex economic activity. These insights remain relevant. Modern economies are organized around financial systems. Financial networks determine how capital flows through the economy. Financial power influences political decisions. The medieval bankers who first understood these principles would recognize the financial systems of today, despite the technological differences.